Imagine waking up one morning, opening your mail, and discovering you are personally on the hook for tens of thousands of euros. A massive, life-ruining financial penalty tied to a company you left years ago. It is a sudden, terrifying freefall into panic. And untangling exactly how someone ends up in this nightmare, well, it's a lot more complicated than it seems. This was the exact reality for a man named Henry. He had been a manager, did his job, and then cleanly moved on with his life. 2 whole years passed. He had completely put this chapter behind him. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, the company suffers a catastrophic collapse, and the people picking up the pieces point the finger squarely at him. They demand he hand over his life savings to cover the losses of a business he hasn't even stepped foot in for years. Enter the antagonist of our story, Thomas. Thomas is the bankruptcy administrator, the liquidator brought in to clean up the financial wreckage of this ruined company. And Thomas sends Henry an incredibly terrifying, unyielding demand. Pay us back the missing money. It was essentially a phantom debt that Henry didn't even know existed. And Thomas wasn't asking nicely either. He was demanding total financial ruin for something Henry felt completely disconnected from. To put this into perspective, we aren't just talking about a rounding error here. The exact demand was for 51,980 euros. That's a sum that can wipe out a person's life savings in an instant. The liquidator was aggressively coming after Henry for this massive amount, completely ramping up the stakes. I mean, how could Henry possibly own nearly 52,000 euros for a business he literally hadn't touched in over 2 years? To understand how we got here, we have to look back at Henry's day-to-day routine when he actually did run the company. It was a timber business, and if you know anything about the timber industry, dealing with small, local suppliers usually means one thing: cash. Henry routinely withdrew cash to buy wood, pay for transport, and, maintain standard, everyday records. Receipts went into the box, transactions were logged. It was just the normal rhythm of how this specific business functioned. In fact, over his entire time as manager, Henry withdrew exactly 42,715 euros just to keep the suppliers paid. And this was completely normal operational behavior. He wasn't sneaking around in the dead of night. He was going to the ATMs, taking out the cash, paying the vendors, collecting receipts, and keeping the gears of the business turning day by day. So let's look at how the timeline actually plays out. Henry takes charge in November 2020. Fast forward to May 2022, and he resigns. He makes a clean, completely official exit. He signs a formal handover document giving all the company files, the receipts, the whole shebang, to a company procurator named Benjamin. Then, a massive 2-year gap passes. Henry is long gone. It isn't until August 2024 that the company completely crashes and burns under its new bosses, Samuel and Edward. And what happens under Samuel and Edward? Absolute chaos. When the company plunges into bankruptcy, these new guys practically vanish. They're dodging law enforcement, they ignore all legal requests from the liquidator, and mysteriously, every single physical company file, including that box of receipts Henry had meticulously handed over 2 years earlier, just vanishes into thin air. So now Tars, the liquidator, steps into this absolute mess. He's got a bankrupt company, 0 physical documents, and 2 completely unresponsive current bosses who are nowhere to be found. But Thomas needs someone to pay the bill to satisfy the angry creditors. Frustrated by the missing records and totally unable to track down Samuel and Edward, Thomas decides to point his crosshairs at the only person who actually answers the phone, Henry. Thomas starts digging through literally the only thing he has left, digital bank records. He zeroes in on the ATM withdrawals. He even tries to use withdrawals made by Henry's former colleague and company owner, George, to paint Henry as careless and completely liable. See, George used an old card to withdraw 2,450 euros early on, and Henry withdrew the rest. But Thomas just lumps it all together, claims the money was basically stolen, and demands Henry pay every last cent back. The court did not focus on emotion. It asked one key legal question. Can a former manager be presumed guilty of theft simply because the current management lost the financial records? That is the core issue here. Because if the new guys burn the building down, can the old manager really be sued just because his paperwork was inside it? This is exactly where the human trauma crashes into the cold, hard mechanics of civil law. Look at the massive gap between Thomas's logic and the actual evidence. Thomas was making a huge, sweeping assumption that because the physical receipts were currently missing, it legally meant Henry must have stolen the money 2 years prior. But the documented reality, Henry had executed a totally legal, signed handover of all those documents to Benjamin. It just doesn't make sense. If he had taken company property home with him when he quit, that wouldn't be record keeping, that would literally be theft. You see, to make Henry pay, the law requires proving three very specific things for civil liability: an unlawful action, actual financial damages, and a direct causal link between the two. The liquidator essentially just skipped the very first step. Thomas tried to rely on a presumption of guilt, arguing that without receipts, Henry's cash withdrawals were automatically unlawful damages. But you can't just skip ahead like that. The judge completely acknowledged that Thomas was operating in an information vacuum. And yeah, it's undeniably tough being a liquidator when the current bosses hide everything from you. But the court firmly stated that you cannot legally use pure speculation to fill those gaps. You can't just guess that a former employee stole money simply because you can't find the folders they legally surrendered to someone else 2 years ago. This logic perfectly shows us how the burden of proof actually works in these complex financial disputes. Thomas wanted a presumption of guilt. He basically wanted to force Henry to magically prove his innocence without any of the documents. But the court said, no way. The burden of proof means the liquidator has to actually prove damages occurred first. You cannot force Henry to prove the money wasn't stolen if Thomas hasn't even proven that it was stolen in the first place. So the absolutely crucial point here is this: withdrawing cash is not inherently illegal. Pulling cash out of ATMs to run a cash-heavy timber business is completely standard commercial practice. The simple act of taking the money out does not equal theft. What actually matters is how the money was used, and the liquidator brought zero proof that Henry used it for anything other than buying timber for the business. The court then laid out a serious reality check. First off, Samuel and Edward, the final bosses, were legally responsible for keeping the records safe, not Henry. Second, the National Tax Authority hadn't raised any red flags during Henry's time, meaning he was actually running a healthy, tax-compliant operation. And third, bank records proved Henry didn't just take cash out. He frequently deposited massive sums right back into the accounts when deals fell through. And let's be real, thieves don't generally put the money back. The judge delivered this stunning phrase to describe the liquidator's aggressive lawsuit. They called it unjustified, retrospective perfectionism. I love that phrasing because it highlights exactly how unfair this whole situation was. You can't expect a former manager to have kept perfect, secret, duplicate copies of company documents he legally surrendered 2 years prior, just in case a future liquidator goes on a witch hunt. Keeping secret copies like that would actually be a violation of company secrets. In the end, the hammer fell entirely in Henry's favor. The €51,980 claim was completely dismissed. The court rejected the liquidator's attempt to make Henry pay for the current management's sins. Finally, Henry was free from the nightmare. He wouldn't lose his life savings for a company that imploded long after he walked out the door. This case leaves us with such a fascinating look at how civil law allocates risk. It doesn't deal in moral outrage, it deals in evidence, timelines, and legal burdens. When businesses fail and chaos reigns, the system is designed to stop desperate administrators from just pinning the blame on whoever is easiest to find. True responsibility means tracking the facts, not punishing the past for the failures of the present. But it does leave us with a lingering thought. If a company's files can just vanish into thin air, how confident are you that your past employers are securing the paperwork that proves your innocence? One decision changed everything. Watch the next case right here, and subscribe for more real stories.